Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we have something really exciting for you. We'll be breaking down 5 hidden trading concepts that pros use to dominate their lane. This will truly take your laning to the next level. We'll be covering advanced techniques such as zone of influence, spacing, auto-spacing, tethering, and input buffering. I promise if you watch until the end, this guide will change the way you look at laning. Alright, enough hype, let's jump straight into it. Now, to understand the more advanced concepts we'll be getting into later, you first need to understand a concept called zone of influence. Zone of influence is the foundation to positioning properly in lane. Zone of influence is best explained visually. For example, let's use the champion Annie. Each one of Annie's abilities, including her auto attacks, have a range associated with them. Each one of their ranges can be represented with a circle around her. Her W ability has the lowest range at 600. Both her Q and auto attack has 625 range, and her ultimate can hit you from a maximum range of 890. Each one of these circles can represent her zone of influence. For example, let's say Annie is level 3 and doesn't have access to her ultimate. Then her zone of influence would be represented by the 625 range, since her Q and auto attack can hit you from this distance. By being aware that Annie's zone of influence is represented by 625 range, you can then stay outside of that range to stay safe and be aware entering inside of the range is dangerous. That sounds simple enough, but there are more layers to this. For example, let's take a look at Ryze's zone of influence. His auto attack is his lowest range at 550. His E and W abilities both have 615 range, and his Q ability has a range of 1000. If all you understood about zone of influence is to stay outside of the enemy's highest range spell, then you would constantly be standing 1000 range from Ryze, which isn't very practical. In reality, you have to identify what we will refer to as the threat. In this case, Ryze's Q ability does have 1000 range, but can be blocked by minions and is a skill shot. Compare that to Ryze's E and W, which are point and click spells and can't be blocked by minions. This means that Ryze's E and W are much more threatening, so although his Q can have a range of 1000, his zone of influence is determined by the largest threat, which is his E and W that have a range of 615. We can take this concept one step further. Let's use Victor as an example. Victor's auto attack range is 525, his Q has a range of 600, and his E has a range of 1025. Now, Victor's Q can be the most threatening zone to enter, since it both shields him and empowers his next auto attack. However, unlike in the case of Ryze, Victor's long-range ability, his E, can actually do a fair bit of damage and go through minions. This makes both his E range and his Q range a threat. However, there's one key distinction, that his E has a very long cooldown. This means that while his E is available, Victor's zone of influence can be 1025 range. However, once the cooldown is used, this zone of influence will lower to 600, the range of his Q. And once that cooldown is used, his zone of influence lowers once again to his auto attack range. So to quickly recap, zone of influence is the maximum range of each of the opponent's spells. The spell with the furthest range can dictate the opponent's zone of influence, such as in the case of Annie. However, since champions have multiple spells, this creates multiple zones, some which are more powerful than others, such as in the case of Ryze. When this happens, the most threatening spell will dictate the zone of influence. Additionally, when an ability is on cooldown, it no longer counts towards the zone of influence since the spell can't be used, temporarily shortening the opponent's range. Great, so you now understand zone of influence, but how do you actually use this concept to smash your lane opponent? This is where the concept of spacing comes in. Spacing can be defined by staying at the maximum distance from the opponent's zone of influence. For example, let's say I'm playing Orianna against Annie and neither of us are level 6. Orianna's zone of influence is defined by her Q ability, which has a range of 1000. Compare this to Annie's zone of influence, which is defined by her Q ability, which has a range of 625. Orianna will use the concept of spacing to take advantage of this range difference. She will stay within 1000 range to be able to land her Q ability on Annie, while also staying outside of the 625 range that will allow Annie to land her own Q ability. To understand just how powerful spacing can be, imagine if Orianna didn't understand any of this and was standing outside of her zone of influence, 1000 range. Well then Annie would never be under any pressure during the laning phase, since Orianna wouldn't be in range to land Harass. On top of this, when Orianna does move in to try to land Harass, she has to move forward an extra amount of distance to get in range to land her Q. This telegraphs to Annie that Orianna is looking to land her Q ability and makes it easy for Annie to anticipate, react, and dodge. Compare this to when Orianna is standing within 1000 range. At any moment she can cast her Q ability to harass Annie, putting constant pressure on her and making it difficult for her to react. So by not understanding spacing, you can stand too far away from the opponent. That being said, you can also stand too close. For example, if Orianna doesn't understand that she needs to be outside of Annie's zone of influence, which is 625 range, then suddenly, instead of harassing Annie, she'll be taking trades with her. So many of you are probably thinking, great, I now understand how I can use spacing when I have a range advantage on the opponent, but how do I use this concept of spacing when I have the range disadvantage? Well, let's look at Orianna against Annie, but this time from Annie's perspective. We identify that Orianna's zone of influence is 1000 range and look to stay outside it. Now, remember, spacing is the act of staying just outside this range. If Annie stands too far back, let's say 1500 range, then she's no longer spacing properly. Annie will find herself having no pressure at all and being zoned from minions, not being able to react to jungle ganks or the enemy's abilities going on cooldown. When we space properly, we stay as close as possible, but still outside the opponent's zone of influence. The benefit to us is that it will bait the opponent into using their spell since they will think you're in range when you're really not. And remember from earlier, when a spell goes on cooldown, this can change the zone of influence. In the case of Orianna, this significantly lowers it to 525 or auto attack range. Suddenly, Annie has the range advantage, and she can use this timing window to move forward and look to land her own Q ability. This is all done by spacing properly. Now, one other term that has been thrown around a lot and has caused confusion for a lot of players is the term auto spacing. This originally gained a lot of attention after Doublelift tweeted about it. Although it may sound confusing, auto spacing is exactly the same as spacing, just with auto attacks. Since Doublelift is an AD carry player, auto attack range becomes much more important in the laning phase in bot lane compared to spellcasters in mid lane. For example, let's say I'm playing Caitlyn against Vayne. Caitlyn has 650 auto attack range to Vayne's 550, 100 range advantage. To use this advantage, I would have to auto space properly, auto attacking Vayne at my maximum range to prevent her from being able to auto attack back. If I don't know my maximum range and instead move too far forward, I'll put myself in range of Vayne and trade auto attacks. Before we go further, I quickly want to mention that our YouTube guides are just a taste of a highly effective system that we've spent thousands of hours building with challenger players over at Skillcapped. We're so confident it will help you improve, you can input your rank to see where you'll end up before using our service. For example, if you're Gold 4, we'll guarantee you hit Platinum 3 while using Skillcapped. If you don't, you get a refund. Simple as that. Sign up today to stop wasting time and start carrying your games. Great, so you now understand the zone of influence, spacing, and auto spacing. This allows us to move into an even more advanced concept, tethering. To understand tethering, let's again look at the Orianna and Annie matchup. So Orianna has a range advantage in her zone of influence with 1000 range. Annie will look to space properly by standing just on the edge of this range. However, let's say Orianna doesn't cast her ability and instead moves forward 50 units. What should Annie do? Well, Annie would want to continue to space properly and move back 50 units as a response. This means that Annie has to react and mimic Orianna's movements. When Orianna moves forward, Annie moves back. And when Orianna moves back, Annie moves forward. This is tethering, the act of constantly spacing and maintaining a specific distance between you and the target. Now remember earlier, Orianna uses her Q ability, which lowers her zone of influence and allows Annie to try and close the distance to land her Q. Well, in that scenario, Orianna would then look to space properly and stand outside of Annie's Q range of 625. This would then cause tethering to occur once again. Every time Annie moves forward, Orianna moves back, and when Annie moves back, Orianna moves forward. So it's these three layers, zone of influence, spacing, and tethering, that creates the dance that we call positioning in lane. Next, let's talk about input buffering. Input buffering is a way to cast your abilities faster than the normal human reaction time. For example, let's say you're playing Annie and want to flash ult a target. Most players would flash first and then press their ultimate after. This is wrong. Instead, you can input buffer your ultimate. First, you press your ultimate on the opponent, which doesn't cast since it's outside of your range. Then, you press flash so it puts you within range, and you'll see Annie instantly cast her ultimate. The increased speed in which you're able to cast abilities when you input buffer makes it impossible for the opponent to react and dodge your spell. For example, if you incorrectly flash and then ult as Annie, the opponent could flash as soon as you flash as a reaction and dodge it. Input buffering prevents the opponent from being able to dodge. This can be done on a variety of champions. For example, if you're playing Twisted Fate and pull a gold card, most players would flash and then click on the opponent. That's wrong, and instead you should input buffer it. First click on the opponent and then flash, and Twisted Fate will instantly release it. Alright, so what does input buffering have to do with the zone of influence, spacing, and tethering? Well, there's another way you can use input buffering in lane. For example, let's say you're playing Annie against LeBlanc. LeBlanc is going to want to jump in, quickly land her spells, and jump back out of your range. However, if we input buffer our Q ability by activating it on LeBlanc when she's outside of its range, then the second she jumps in range, Annie will cast it. This can be a useful technique when spacing. For example, Annie's zone of influence is 625. However, LeBlanc's zone of influence is higher at around 700. Whenever LeBlanc lands her Q ability, it's likely she'll use her W to jump on Annie to activate the second portion of damage. As Annie, you can use input buffering in this scenario. As soon as LeBlanc casts her Q, you can input buffer your own Q, anticipating she would jump in range of it. When she does, it will cast instantly. This prevents the scenario where LeBlanc lands free harass on you by comboing faster than you're able to react. Alright, we went over a lot, so let's briefly recap. You first learned about Zone of Influence. A champion's Zone of Influence is the maximum range of each of their spells and is often defined by the spell with the furthest range. However, you also have to take the level of threat into consideration, as sometimes long-range spells can be relatively weak. Additionally, a champion using a long-range spell and putting it on cooldown can cause a temporary decrease in their Zone of Influence. You then learned about spacing. Spacing is staying at the edge of the opponent's Zone of Influence. When used offensively, this allows us to constantly apply pressure while the enemy is unable to fight back. When used defensively, it prevents us from taking unnecessary damage, can bait the opponent to miss spells, while still having pressure of our own. You then learned about the term auto-spacing and how this is the same thing as regular spacing, just with auto-attack range instead of spell range. All of this led into a more advanced concept called tethering, the act of constantly spacing and maintaining a specific distance between you and the target. If they move forward, you move back. If they move back, you move forward, constantly keeping the correct amount of space between you and the opponent. And lastly, we covered input buffering, which can be used to give you inhuman reaction times. By casting an ability when an opponent is outside of its range, we can input buffer it. We can use this input buffering offensively by flashing, or defensively by predicting the opponent moving into us. Alright, so that's it for this one. What trick did you not know about? Let us know in the comments section below. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to catch our free releases. We'd appreciate it a lot, and be sure to check out our website if you're serious about improving. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next guide.